question of the inspiration of Scripture is connected to the question of canon. That is, we might make the case that the New Testament is inspired by God. We see God's fingerprints on it, but exactly what books would fall into that category? So you see the relationship there. And this raises the question then, how were the New Testament books in particular here chosen as part of the canon? Now, this is a complicated process in some ways, but there are some general guidelines that really, I think, drove the process that will help us to understand. First, a mistaken notion. It isn't like a bunch of people who had authority in themselves got together and just picked the ones that they said were the right New Testament books. And in virtue of their picking them, had the authority because authority was actually invested in the group, and they get to decide which books will represent them. That's not the way it worked. If you think of the word canon means authority. That is, what are the authoritative works in themselves that we go to in the New Testament era to know about God and His plan for salvation? Well, this presumes a prior question, and that is, before there were books for the New Testament, what was the canon then? Well, Jesus trained 12 different people, and some more, if you consider Paul kind of after the cross, to follow after him, to take his message after him, and promised them in the Upper Room Discourse in John chapter 15 that he would bring to remembrance all the things that he had taught them so they would be able to communicate to others. And because of this, because of their close association with Jesus, this group of men became the standard or the rule, or to put it simply, the canon. So the early church looked to the apostles for the authoritative word about what was sound doctrinally. What happened when the apostles died? They're gone. Was there a whole new generation of apostles that had the same authority? It doesn't look that way. No biblical evidence for that. What ended up happening with the early church is they said, well, since the apostles are now gone, their writings still remain. The things that they said and instructed us regarding are still here. Those things are the authority now that those men are no longer alive. And so the central question with regards to the canon was, does any particular book bear with it apostolic authority? That is, was it written by a bona fide apostle who had the authority in himself, and therefore the authority would be in his word? Or was the book written by someone associated with a bona fide apostle, close enough that it gives authority to his work? Luke would be an example of somebody associated with the Apostle Paul. Mark would be associated with the Apostle Peter, and therefore would have authority in that regard. And you have others that were very, very tightly connected to the apostolic band, like Jude, for example, and James, clearly an apostle, the half-brother of Jesus, a leader of the early church. And so consequently, these books had authority in themselves because of their authorship. And so the early church then didn't just assemble a collection of books, but there already was a collection of books that virtually everybody agreed on had authority. There are a couple of exceptions, 2 Peter, Revelation, Hebrew, partly because they weren't exactly sure who wrote Hebrews. But this was something that they worked out. The point that I want to leave with you is it's not a haphazard affair. It wasn't just a matter of voting by a bunch of people who saw themselves as the authority, but was rather an act of Christian leaders who recognized the authority inherent in those books, principally because of the apostolic connection that those books had. And that is the foundational way in which the New Testament documents were viewed as authoritative and part of the canon.